This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy.
The Noose. The men who formed the present government of the USSR were the representatives of those who for centuries had ruled the kings, presidents, and governments of the West through the power of the purse. While not wise, they were highly educated and shrewd. They well knew how the prohibition of usury and debt in the Christian West in earlier years had hurt them and benefited Westerners. The lesson was not forgotten. This land of the Rus that they had first ruled as Khazaria, and again as the Tsar Khazarian tax collectors of the Mongols, had for the third time been returned to their rule. Now, in the role of the ruler, they naturally set up an economic system most advantageous to themselves. For their new state, they reinstated the tally system. The new Soviet government was given the power to issue rubles in any amount at any time they chose and tax them out of existence again, leaving no debt as a bad aftertaste. What use would it be for the USSR to copy the Tsar's system and the United States system of borrowing from and owing the Rothschild banks? Russia had been conquered. It had been foreclosed. What was needed now was a simple workable system that would not cause trouble later on. Today, Western governments are deeply in debt to the international bankers. Each day that goes by, this debt grows larger and larger. If the Soviets do nothing but encourage the West to borrow increasing amounts of money for defense and giveaways, in time, this load of debt will inevitably grow to the point that it will strangle the West. They will be unable to raise and equip armies to defend themselves because of this debt. All the while, the government of the Soviets owes nothing. When they need a dam, a merchant fleet, or a manufacturing plant, they simply issue rubles to pay for the expenditure and then tax them out of existence again. The internal debt of the Soviet government is nothing. For the Slav. In the Soviet Union, freedom from debt is one more government monopoly. For the Slavs, the economic life is the same. They are in debt for refrigerators, cars, furniture, and are servants to their usury banks. The banking system which owns this debt is now the Gosbank, the Soviet copy of a Western central banking system. It issues interest-free money for government expenditures, but at the same time, its method of lending 10 rubles for 11 to private citizens is exactly the same as in pre-revolution Russia. Its effect on the people is also the same. The Gosbank is debt-free within the USSR. It, however, owes the Bank of Europe tens of billions of dollars. Since the Gosbank is borrower from the banks of Europe, according to God's law, they are servants. The borrower is slave to the lender. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7. As servants, they can only do what they are ordered to do. The ones doing the lending reside in New York and London. The Gosbank receives its orders from the lenders who are now headquartered in New York and London. This is the reason the Soviet Union suffers no reverses. The Slavs of the USSR have become the Slav horse, which is used by the international banks to foreclose debt-ridden borrowers the world over who can no longer produce interest to pay on their loans. The Ashkenazics. Christians point to the fact that Israel's ex-leader, Begin, is an Ashkenazic Jew, as is Gus Hall, the secretary of the Communist Party USA, Karl Marx, the so-called, quote, spokesman of communism, as well as the illustrious Rothschild family. Everywhere one looks, one finds Ashkenazic Jews in government, in business, on TV, everywhere. Christians then point to Genesis chapter 10, verses 1 to 4 to explain this phenomenon. Now, these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Japheth, Gomer, and the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz is the son of Gomer. In Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 4 to 6, God says, I will bring thee forth in all thine army, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah. In that day when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts, and thou shalt come up against my people of Israel. The descendants of Khazar, the seventh son of Togarmah, along with Ashkenazic part of Gomer, came down from the north and first prepared the way with their financiers and merchants. Now they have massively invaded, occupied, and rule the kings and lands of Christian Israel in the West as well as the lands promised to Christian Israel in the Holy Land. Christians read the scriptures and tremble. The thing that God warned would happen in the last days has come to pass. Ashkenaz, the son of Gomer, is here. Section 7. Usury comes to America. Chapter 22. Captain John Smith. John Smith was born on a farm in England. Seeking adventure, he journeyed to Vienna and joined a company of cavalry fighting the Turks. His natural talents as a soldier were early recognized, and he was promoted to captain of a company of 250 men. At that time, the Christian armies were fighting the Mohammedan armies at the very gates of Vienna in the heart of Europe. The champion fighter of all the Turkish armies challenged the champion of the Christian armies to single combat. Smith was chosen to represent the Christians. Meeting on level ground, the two champions spurred their horses at each other. Smith's lance passed through the head of his Saracen opponent. Quickly severing the Turk's head, he rode from the battlefield with the grisly trophy held high on the point of his lance. The next day, another challenge was made by the second-best Saracen champion. Smith met the new challenger on the same ground. Spears were broken in the first pass. Smith then drew his pistol and fired, breaking the rein arm of the Turk, which caused his horse to lurch, throwing him from the saddle. Smith quickly dispatched him, and for a second time carried the head of his opponent from the battlefield. The third day, yet another challenge was made by the third best of the Saracen warriors. This time it was a close thing. Spears were broken. Smith's battle axe was knocked from his hand. As the Saracen champion raised his axe to finish him off, Smith quickly drew his dagger and thrust it under the Saracen's raised arm where the armor joined, killing him instantly. For the third time he rode from the field with the head of his foe. The three best warriors of the entire Muslim army had been vanquished by a single Christian champion in 3 successive days. Captain John Smith was the hero of the Christian armies. The king presented him with a coat of arms, appropriately emblazoned with 3 Saracen heads. Soon after, there was a terrific battle between the opposing armies. In the melee, Smith was knocked unconscious and fell under a pile of bodies. He was later found by Saracen looters, made a prisoner, and taken to Constantinople and sold as a slave. A Turk bought him and took him to the far side of the Black Sea, a long way from the war in Austria. The master was brutal. Smith took a wooden pole close to hand and smashed in his skull. Making his way northward to Russia, iron slave collar and all, he was passed from one friendly hand to another until he made his escape back to his regiment, where he was given a hero's welcome. Deciding that he needed a rest after the rigors of fighting and slavery, he asked for and received his discharge. He was awarded a large bag of gold for his services. His ship to England was attacked by pirates. The vigorous defense of the ship's crew and passengers enabled the ship's captain to capture several of the pirate ships. These captured ships brought a fine price when sold in Italy. Leaving his ship, he continued his journey by foot. He walked the length of Italy, across southern France, and through Spain into North Africa. Arriving in England after having seen much of the known world, he heard about some sort of adventure getting underway, having to do with a settlement in far-off Virginia. Quickly bored with the quiet English countryside, he joined the venture. Settlement at Jamestown. Shares for the new Virginia Company sold for £12.10. On November 20th, 1606, the Crown instructed the newly appointed Virginia government to 1. Preach the Christian religion, 2. See that land descended as it did in England, and 3. Ensure that there would be trial by jury. In 1607, 3 ships, Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, reached Jamestown Island, Virginia. After a period of indecisive leadership, Captain John Smith took command. This was a shock for both the colonists and the Indians. Smith was accustomed to the rough and tumble of military life, giving orders and being obeyed. He recognized that to survive the colony would have to whip himself into shape in the limited time that remained before winter. Like it or not, everyone worked. Tender hands quickly blistered, applying axe and shovel to fort and shelter. Lips that cursed in protest found a pitcher of cold water poured down their sleeve. 1 pitcher for each curse. The Bible forbade cursing. Lying was cured with the whip. This hard-bitten leader, who had killed scores in defense of his Christian faith, would not allow a light trespass of its laws. Religious services were held morning and evening. The new leader quickly came to grips with the Indian problem. The English government had expected to utilize native labor to work gold and silver mines in the Spanish manner. To prepare them for this task, the Queen, the head of the Anglican Church, instructed her colonists to make Samaritans of the natives instead of driving them out. As a consequence, the colonists handled the Indians with kid gloves. The result was that the colonists were cowed by the ferocious natives and afraid to take any actions to stop their constant depredations. They brazenly entered Jamestown anytime they chose, bullied the settlers, and stole whatever they liked. Smith, the new governor, witnessed an Indian openly walking into the fort and stealing a valuable possession belonging to the beleaguered colony. He drew his sword and cut down the offender. Stealing stopped. From that time on, the Indians held Smith in awe. John Smith traveled extensively in Indian country trading with them. His observations built in him a strong dislike of what he saw. He wrote, "The turkeys and other beasts and fowl will exceedingly increase if we beat the savages out of the country. For all times of the year they never spare male or female, old nor young, eggs nor birds, fat nor lean, in season nor out of season. With them all is one." Each Indian village had its wooden idols. At times there were tribal dances. Standing in a circle, the braves would dance and repeat names of children. When all had agreed on one name, that child was fetched and thrown into the flames. No Indian family was safe. In order to pacify their gods, even the chiefs had to give up their children if their names were selected. The treatment of prisoners, especially whites, filled the settlers with horror, which in time developed into a deep hatred. Many times prisoners would be captured when wounded and nursed back to health. They would be well fed so that they would be strong. In this way, they could endure torture a long time. At a chosen time, the prisoners were led to the center of the village and bound to a stake. The Indian women and children were brought forward and allowed to work on them. They were masters of the art. They would remove the flesh from the prisoner's face and head, his private parts, and his intestines. All this was done with amazing deftness. A tortured prisoner was a horror indeed to behold. With careful attention, the Indians could keep such a tortured prisoner alive for 3 days. If rescued, such prisoners always begged for death, not to be released. This introduction to the American Indian encouraged our ancestors to obey the biblical injunction with a will. Quote, "I will send my fear before thee. I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year, lest the land become desolate. By little and little I will drive them out from before thee, until thou be increased and inherit the land. They shall not dwell in thy land, lest they make thee sin against me." Exodus chapter 23, verses 27 to 33. This law was the blueprint for the conquest of America and was followed almost in its entirety. The results can be compared with the Spanish rivals in South America, where this law of dealing with strangers was held in contempt. The United States today is the world's leader, while the Samaritans of South America, with more natural resources, are each year slipping farther into the darkness of superstition and backwardness. Smith also observed that the Indians seldom smiled. They still don't. Accepting the Christian religion easily, it became a Samaritan Christianity. They shed it as easily as they received it. Good neighbors for years, they were the first to try to kill you when they took to the warpath. In the early 1900s, whites were dying at the hands of the Indians in exactly the same way their ancestors did in Virginia in 1607. Only with the advent of usury and the need to convert every debt-free human into a borrower came the concept of the noble savage, weeping tears over beer cans thrown on the ground. This picture of the Indian is a creation of Madison Avenue. It does not exist any more than the false picture of the Indian killing only what he needs. Game is scarce on their reservations because it is totally harvested and as a result exterminated. This ignoring conservation of wildlife is also a trait of others who do not have the law in their hearts. American conservation organizations are even now protesting that groups of Vietnamese and other Oriental immigrants are going through areas of the American West taking birds, eggs, fish both large and small, and all game that moves. They reap a great one-time harvest and leave a wasteland behind them. Today, these sullen, hard-eyed, unsmiling people have been released from their reservations, and they have come to towns and cities where they prey on Christians and each other. As a consequence, the jails of the American West are filled with them. Quote, "Those which ye let remain of them shall be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and shall vex you in the land wherein ye dwell. I shall do to you as I thought to do unto them." Numerology, chapter 33, verse 56. After John Smith returned to England, the colony almost died from starvation. This phase ended in 1613. In 1615, my ancestor, Bartholomew Hoskins, a boy of 15, reached Jamestown. His brother was Protestant chaplain to the Catholic King of England, a situation which landed him in the Tower. His family thought the king might seek revenge on the lad, and so he went to Virginia for safety.